This is an interview with Major Tom Griffin of the Doolittle Raiders. And Tom, if you would, just tell us your story, please, of the Doolittle Raiders.
I was with the 17th Bomb Group at the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. And for the next 6 weeks, our group flew out off of the state of Washington coast, Washington and Oregon, looking for whatever might show up out there. Of course, the people on the West Coast were very nervous because none of us knew whether the Japanese were going to come to America and start bombing our western coast. And so people in California and Oregon and Washington were very nervous in those months. And we flew out every day and sometimes at night looking for whatever we might find out there in relation to the Japanese. But of course, as we learned later, they had no further intention at that time to come to the West Coast. And about 6 weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor, our group suddenly got a notice to pack up and fly to South Carolina. And when we got there, this was late in January of '42. When we got there, we were told that there was a mission being planned which had unusual elements of danger in it. They wanted to warn us that this was the situation, and they wanted people to volunteer for this mission. And as far as I can remember, the whole group stepped forward. After all, we were at war, and I think we all figured dangerous missions were going to be assigned to us. So what they did then, they sent 20 crews of us with our B-25s down to Eglin Field, Florida. And when we got down there, the famous pilot, one of the most famous pilots of the first half of the 20th century, Jimmy Doolittle, showed up. He was a lieutenant colonel. He'd just gotten back in the Air Corps again in the fall of 1939. And he told us he was going to put us through a rigorous training session down there. And it was a very secret training section. The Eglin Field property is a number of acres. It's one of the biggest airports in the country as far as acreage is concerned. And we trained takeoffs and landings on a field back in the boondocks of the Eglin Field property there for the next couple months. The unusual part, of course, of the pilot's training there was getting the B-25 Mitchell in the air in approximately 400 to 500 feet. This is a plane that normally took a minimum of 1,200 to 1,500 feet to be airborne. So the boys had to learn a whole new concept on how to get these planes in the air in the shortest distance possible. And they learned gradually over a number of days to get them in the air between 400 and 500 feet. The rest of us had a rigorous training program also, but that was the most unusual part of our training. In March, about the third week of March, we were told to take off and take 2 days to fly to Sacramento Air Force Base in California, which was a maintenance base. And we had no clearance from our airport, and we just took off without the normal clearances. We were told to go any way we wanted to, just so we arrived at Sacramento 2 days from the time we took off. So we all flew off in different directions. When we got to Sacramento, which is a maintenance base, we found that they were going to put new props on our planes, so there'd be no pitted props. They leaned on our carburetors. That was what they were supposed to do. They didn't always do it very accurately, but our planes were there for about a week while they were doing these things to us. And on the first day of April, we flew over with our 20 planes to the air base at the naval base in San Francisco Bay, and we landed there next to on a runway next to a slip where the newest carrier, the Hornet, was anchored. It had just come in a day or two before that. And we landed our 20 planes, and Doolittle landed the first plane, and when he taxied up, the Navy personnel shouted up to him and told him that they could only accommodate 16 of our planes on this mission. And here, Doolittle had 20 planes and 20 crews all ready to go. So he stood at the end of the runway, and as each plane taxied up after their landing, he would shout out up to the pilot and ask him if everything was all right. And if the pilot, not knowing the importance of this question, this question, if he said anything such as, well, my left engine is a little rough, or anything other than everything is just fine, he was told to taxi over to one side, and in that way he eliminated 4 of the planes. The crews actually came with us on the trip across the ocean. Initially, as a matter of security, because we wouldn't want 4 crews, that's 20 men, walking around the States knowing where we were going to go and what we were going to do. So those men came with us. And actually, they were an expert labor pool for Doolittle to reach in here and there as we went across the Pacific. The 18 days we were going across the Pacific, and change some personnel on some of the crews. So they were an asset even going across the Pacific with us. On the next day, April the 1st, we sailed out of San Francisco Bay, and we had 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers with us. When we got about half an hour past the Golden Gate Bridge out in the Pacific, the loudspeaker came on and made the announcement that this task force was going to go to Japan, off of Japan, and that the Army crews were going to use these planes to bomb targets in Japan. And a great cheer went up, because we were so imbued with the idea of secrecy, we wouldn't tell any of the Navy boys why we were coming on the plane, on the carrier. So now that they knew, and they were very welcome to us from that time on. At first, we were just an inconvenience, because in as much as the Navy crew didn't know what this was all about, they were afraid that their wonderful new carrier was going to be used as a cargo ship to transport a bunch of B-25 people to probably to Hawaii, and they weren't very happy with that. But after they found out that we were going to go across the Pacific, bomb Japan, why our relationship was greatly improved with the crew. And we had many fond memories. One thing that we didn't know when we were in San Francisco Bay that first night, Bull Halsey flew in from Hawaii and met with Jimmy Doolittle in a hotel room in downtown San Francisco. And they talked over this mission. Halsey was going to be in command of the entire task force. There was going to be another carrier and more cruisers involved. Halsey was going to be in command of the task force. The Navy planes from his carrier, the Enterprise, the second carrier that was going with us, would fly cover and reconnoiter out ahead of the task force as we went across the Pacific. And among other things, Halsey told Doolittle that if it was at all possible, he would get the task force within 400 miles of Japan. Because, of course, you understand, we felt, or Doolittle assured us that we could get our planes off the carrier deck, but there was no possibility of a twin-engine bomber landing back on the carrier deck. So the plan had to include our trip from Japan after our bombing missions were over to China, to friendly fields in China. And that was going to be a very long trip, and whether we were going to have enough gas to make that entire flight and get to the Chinese field that was to be ready to take us on was always quite a question. But Doolittle said we would make it, and he was a great leader. He convinced us all that this thing was going to be a success, so we went ahead. When we were at sea about 10 days, we had rendezvoused with Halsey. He had the Enterprise, the carrier of the Enterprise. He had 2 more cruisers and 4 more destroyers, and he was now in command of the whole task force. As we went across the Pacific every morning, we had meetings, and each crew was assigned a specific target in Japan. Most of us, about 11 of us, were going to hit targets in the immediate Tokyo area. One plane was going to bomb the Japanese naval base in the southern part of Tokyo Bay, and 3 of our planes were going to go to other cities to hit some choice targets down there in Nagoya and Kobe and Osaka, and the rest. That accounts for all of our planes then. As we went across the Pacific, each crew was assigned a specific target. Among other things that we were cautioned about was that under no conditions were we to bother Hirohito's house where he lived in Tokyo, because of course he was considered a god figure by the Japanese, and there would be absolutely no advantage to our side to go after their leader in any way or form. It would just unite them all the more against us. So the house of Hirohito was strictly off limits as far as bombing was concerned. We headed across the Pacific, always with the planes from the Enterprise flying out ahead of the task force, looking for whatever might be up there. And we didn't run into any trouble until the 18th day at sea. Now that evening, or late afternoon, we were going to be within 400 miles of Japan. And 2 days prior to the 18th, we had dropped off our 8 destroyers because they could not keep up with the speed, the full speed from that time on that the cruisers and the aircraft carriers had. It was a 2-day dash in towards Japan. And late afternoon or early evening of the 18th day at sea, we were going to be 400 miles from Japan, take off, and head for our targets. That morning, when we were still 650 miles from Japan, we went between Japanese picket ships, 650 miles out. Our intelligence didn't know that they had a cordon of fishing vessels out there, which were actually fishing vessels, but they had a radio equipment which permitted them to be in touch with the home islands. And on that morning, of course, at about 5 or 5:30, they were able to broadcast into the Japanese home islands that an American task force of 2 carriers and 4 cruisers were heading for Japan, out 650 miles. We picked up the fact that they did that. It just took a few minutes for our planes from the Enterprise to sink these ships And also the guns of the cruisers sank these Japanese picket ships. But they had had time to radio in and warn the home islands that we were coming. So Halsey sent word over that we had to take off immediately. And so the takeoff, now the takeoff was something that we'd been thinking about all across the Pacific. We were only going to have 400 feet, and we were going to be overloaded between 1,500 and 2,000 pounds more than the B-25 Mitchell bomber should ever carry for a takeoff. And we had to become airborne at 400 feet. That's all the time, all the length of the carrier deck that we had for takeoff. Jimmy Doolittle said it would work, and he backed that up by taking the first plane off. Now, it happened to be that the weather was very important this morning. It was heavy seas, and we were totally overcast, but the one good thing, we had a wind of about 25 to 30 knots of wind. So with the carrier going full speed into the wind, we were actually taking off. The carrier would go about 30 knots, 25 knots of wind. We were taking off in a wind force of between 50 and 60 knots, which is almost gale force. That gave us the lift that we needed. The carrier deck was rolling and pitching on the takeoff because of the heavy seas, but that didn't bother us so much when we realized that all of this wind was going to get us airborne. The sailor, each one of our planes was brought up to a line 400 feet from the bow, and each one of our planes started rolling. When we were sitting on that line, we had full throttles, pushed full throttles, full flaps, and full brakes. And with this, the signal from the flagman, Navy flagman, released the brakes and rolled down the deck. We probably weren't going any more than 40 or 45 miles an hour when we got to the end of that deck and separated. He timed it. So we got there just as the bow of the carrier started its downward plunge, and we separated there, and it worked. Everybody got off in good shape. I was in plane number 9, and we were on the deck, laying on the deck in these later. It took about 4 minutes on an average from one plane, 4 to 5 minutes from one plane to the next takeoff. The Navy boys would drag the planes up to that line. Then they would go through the same routine as the takeoff. We only had one casualty on that whole thing, and we all took off from that same line. Being in plane number 9, we had a lot more deck. We could have 200 more feet or more to take off. But the thing was, it was such a close, we only had 6 feet of clearance from our right wing tip to the island. That gave us 6 feet from our left wheel to the left edge of the flight deck. So in your takeoff run, if you veered to the right or left 6 feet, your takeoff run was over. So the shorter the run, the less chance you have of hitting something or going over. So we all were pulled up to that same line and took off, even though there was a lot more space for takeoff later. We couldn't risk going one way or the other. And we all got off. We didn't, of course, because we were so concerned about our fuel at this time, that there was no effort made. I get that. My throat betrays me. We made no effort to form up because that takes gas. So each plane went in on its own, and we were separated just enough that in most every case, we never saw another B-25. There were 4 or 5 minutes ahead of us. But after we were airborne towards Tokyo, about 2 hours, the whole weather situation had changed. The overcast cleared up. We had a nice sunny day. And that nice sunny day prevailed from about 10 o'clock in the morning until late afternoon, way down in the China Sea as we were heading for China. So we had a nice sunny day over Japan and all that. We, as I say, we never could see another one of our planes. Plane number 9 hit the northeastern section of Tokyo at about, I think it was about 12, it was sometime between 12 and 1 o'clock. And when we hit that part, we started to pick up flak. And we could see where 9 planes or 8 planes had hit targets in the Tokyo area ahead of us, smoke and fires from our boys. And the Japanese anti-aircraft were shooting flak all over the sky over Tokyo. And we flew in at rooftop level to make it more difficult for their anti-aircraft to hit us and for their pursuit to engage us in combat or to try to shoot us down. And the result of those tactics were that they didn't shoot any of us down. We learned later that some of the planes were hit not seriously by flak, but all of them were able to stay airborne. In our plane number 9, it just happened, we flew across Tokyo at rooftop level. It flew right over Hirohito's house at about 50 feet. A big white castle-like thing in a park-like setting with a lagoon and all. And the old boy was probably down in the basement, several tiers down by then. We pulled down to the northern part of Tokyo Bay and headed across to hit our target, which was a factory in the Kawasaki district of Tokyo, the southern part, right on the Tokyo Bay. And we made our run on the target from where my desk was and where the pilot and co-pilot were. We couldn't see what we hit, but the top turret gunner and the bombardier down in the nose said they really flattened the target. And we didn't know until a couple of years after the war ended. In the Japanese archives, they had records of what each one of our planes did. And it turned out that we did not hit our target, which was a factory making tanks and things. Its immediate neighbor is what we flattened, and that was the Tokyo Gas and Electric Company. We put it out of business that day, our plane, which wasn't a bad switch. No. We pulled up to 1,500 feet to make our bomb run, and after we dropped our bombs, we went back down to rooftop level, but we were at 1,500 feet, so we would not be subject to the concussion of our own bombs. Now we dropped back down and flew out to sea. We all flew out to sea about 50 miles to confuse the Japanese defenses, to make them think that we were going back out to a carrier. And this did apparently confuse the Japanese a great deal. That plus the fact that we flew right down on the deck the whole day, which meant their radar couldn't pick us up, and their pursuits had a much difficult time trying to find us. As a matter of fact, they didn't find us. The only experience we had during that long afternoon, we went out about 50 miles off the Japanese coast, and we turned right and paralleled the Japanese coast all that afternoon until we got down to the southern tip of the Japanese islands. And during that flight, the Japanese had received the radio messages from those 2 picket ships. They knew that an American task force was coming. They knew the range of Navy planes and knew that if that task force continued to come, it had to sail another day to get close enough for the short-range Navy planes to do any damage. So they figured they had 24 hours to get together a Navy and air strike force to hit our task force. They had no idea that long-range Army planes were on the deck. And that's what confused them so much in their defense tactics. And one time during that afternoon, we got too close to a Japanese cruiser. They were gathering together this fleet that during that day to hit our task force the next day. And by this time, they knew that Japan had been attacked, and they knew we were enemy planes. And this cruiser we got too close to opened up on us. And it opened up with every gun it had. And we flew through columns of water for what seemed like an eternity. And we stayed right down on the deck and flew right through these columns. They threw up all around us, and they never hit us. It was just a miracle that they didn't hit us. We finally got out of range and went on our merry way. When we got down to the southern tip of the Japanese islands, we turned right and headed across the China Sea. Now, it was late afternoon now, and we had about 5 hours of flight across the China Sea to get to the China coast. Now, as we headed due west into the China Sea, finally the weather was changing on us. Way up ahead, we could see where there were a huge storm building up, and it was late afternoon, early evening now. And we pulled up to 1,500 feet and took what we call a wind drift. Now, we hadn't been anticipating the normal westerly wind out of China across the China Sea. That's the normal wind that you get there. And we had to use that in our calculations. Now, this big storm up ahead made all the difference for us. We pulled up and took a wind drift and discovered that instead of a headwind, a westerly wind, we had a wind out of the east, a tailwind, and it was a strong tailwind due to this weather condition up ahead. And this made all the difference until we realized we were getting this big break on this wind. We had anticipated running out of gas about 100 miles short of the China coast. Now, this wind made all the difference. As we headed into the China Sea and knowing about this wind, we pulled up. 15 of our 16 planes were together on this part of the flight. 11 of us opted to pull up into the storm up to 10,000 feet, now that we knew we had a tailwind. 4 of our people decided, we had taken so much radio equipment out of our planes, we couldn't talk from plane to plane. We only had radio inside of each plane. So each plane had to decide what they wanted to do. 4 of them stayed down in contact with the water and ditched along the China coast. They were running real low on gas. And that's what Ted Lawson did, the fellow that wrote the book 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. He put his wheels down, and he saw a long, smooth, sandy beach, and he was going to land, and the wheels hit the white caps, and they cartwheeled in. And they all lived, but they were all bunked up. That was the story of 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. Three other planes ditched in the water. One of those crews were captured, all 5 men. 3 men of another crew that ditched got to shore and were captured. 2 of them drowned trying to swim ashore. So the Japanese captured 8 of our men. The rest of us, 11 planes, opted to pull up to 10,000 feet. We knew that the highest mountains in that part of China went to 8,000 feet. So we wanted to clear it was nighttime now. We were in a big storm. we could hardly see our wingtips. And we just flew into this storm. It's all we could do. We couldn't let down. Just when we ran out of gas, we all bailed out. 55 men bailed out of 11 planes. And that was quite an ordeal. Bailing out of those planes. But of the 55 men that bailed out, only one man was killed. About 6 men had non-death-threatening injuries, like broken bones of one kind or another. But the rest of us all had wild flights down in our parachutes in that storm, but we all lived through it. And in my case, my chute hung up in a tree just high enough to let me reach the ground. Nobody could have been luckier. We had some fellows that went over cliffs and had broken bones, half a dozen of the fellows, but I had a very lucky landing, and my shroud lines just let me reach the ground, and I unbuckled my chute and walked away, so I was very fortunate. Now, the one crew that I've been telling you about, 15 crews, one crew, when they bombed their target over Tokyo, opted. He looked at his gas gauge and he said, well, we'll never get to to China. So they flew across Japan and turned right and flew up to Vladivostok. And they landed there. Now, the Russians at that time, in the springtime of '42, had their hands full with the Germans. They were having an awful time fighting the Germans. And they did not want to have any trouble with Japan at that time. So they took that crew, of course we never saw the plane again, but they took that crew and put them under house arrest for 15 months. And during those 15 months, they traveled clear across Russia. And they were in different cities from time to time, always under house arrest, until after about 15 months of that, they were down near what is the Iranian border now. It was Persia, called Persia then. And with the help of some friendly Russians, they actually got spirited over the border into friendly Persia. And but for 15 months, they were under house arrest by the Russians. So that accounts for that crew. The rest of us worked our way across China in the ensuing days and weeks.
What was the area that you bailed out at?
Kianxi. In our plane, we happened to get farther inland. We were 300 miles inland before we ran out of gas. And at Kianxi province, the second province, most all of our boys bailed out at Shikian province. Now, my Chinese pronunciation isn't right, but it's roughly how it's spelled out. That's the province south of Shanghai along the coast. And it was occupied by the Japanese. And the friendly Chinese, when they found out who these Americans were, spirited all of our boys, but those 8 men I told you they captured, spirited our boys out of that part of China into free China over a period of weeks, and got us to freedom. And the Japanese were so upset about what these Chinese had done in that part of China to help us. They went through that province, and it estimated they killed thousands and thousands of Chinese. Any Chinese people or villages or towns where they suspected they helped us, they just leveled the place and killed the occupants. It's a terrible thing they did. But and so they paid a terrible price for it. Now, to summarize, we worked our way over a period of weeks back to Chongqing, which was the headquarters city of Chiang Kai-shek and the Free Chinese. We left about 4 or 5 crews with the newly formed 14th Air Force in China. And we went down and flew over the hump, over the Himalayas, into India, and we left about 4 crews with the 10th Air Force. We Doolittle Raiders never flew together as a group. The rest of us over a period of weeks and all, about 30 some of us flew out of India across Africa to South America and then up to Washington, D.C. We got there in late June, and we'd gone completely around the world for that mission. And when we got there, they gave us 2 weeks leave, and we were assigned to new outfits for the invasion of North Africa. The Doolittle raid made a tremendous amount of difference in the Pacific War. Up to the time of the Doolittle raid, the Japanese were running wild, they turned the Pacific Ocean into a Japanese lake. They were ruling everything. But because of our raid, they decided to change their tactics. They had been driving south. They had taken over places like Guam, and they'd gone into the different places in the China coast there, and they put a large army in the Philippines.
Singapore.
Went down to Singapore and the Dutch East Indies. They were heading that way. It looked like Australia would probably be next. But they decided that they'd better stop after the Doolittle raid, head across the Pacific to end this kind of a threat against the home islands, take over what was left of our defenses in the Hawaiian Islands, and open up the west coast to attack. They figured that was the next thing to do. But the first thing that they had to do as they came across the Pacific was to take over the little Wake Island. They had to have that in their hands, and that's where the great change in the Pacific War came.
Wake or Midway, Tom?
Uh-huh.
Wake or Midway?
Midway. What did I say?
You said Wake.
Oh, I meant with Midway.
Right.
Yeah, I meant with Midway Island. And of course, our intelligence, naval intelligence, had broken their code, and they knew they were coming. And they had our two carriers, the Hornet and the Enterprise, and then they had a third carrier, the Yorktown. And they had them sitting up about 200 miles north of those islands, Midway, waiting for the Japanese to strike. And when the Japanese struck Midway, it's all history what our Navy boys did. They flew down there, sunk all 4 of the Japanese carriers in the Battle of Midway. It's a tremendous victory for us. Changed the whole tenor of the Pacific War and gave us a whole year to build up our Navy forces and our Air Forces to really go after the Japanese in a good way. And then, of course, they got embroiled in Guadalcanal and fighting down in there, and over a period of months, that turned into a disaster for them too. That was an awful battle, but they lost there. So you might say from the Battle of Midway, for the rest of the next 3.5 years of the war, the Japanese were on the defensive. Instead of being entirely on the offensive up to Midway, they were on the defensive everywhere. And it got worse and worse for them as the months and years went by there. And our forces took one island after another until we got clear up to Iwo Jima and the big one up there, Okinawa. So our little contribution changed the whole tenor of the war. You see, we do little Tokyo Raiders want to get as much credit for our little mission as possible, and that's roughly the story of the Doolittle raid. It was a great experience, and it changed the whole tenor of the Pacific War.
Well, thank you very much, Tom, and that'll conclude our interview for today, and thank you again. This is an interview with Major Tom Griffin. We're going to discuss his contracting of malaria after the Doolittle raid, and then his experiences in North Africa. So, Tom, if you would.
I told you how we left several crews with the newly formed 14th Air Force in China. The rest of us flew over the hump into India, and we left 4 crews with the 10th Air Force in India. The rest of us, about 30 some of us, got orders to return back to the States. India, however, I contacted Malaria, and I was in I was down in Karachi. I was in Karachi when I went to the hospital with malaria. The first big city, Calcutta. I was in Calcutta when I got sick, and by the time I got to Karachi, I was diagnosed as having malaria, and I was there in the hospital with malaria for about 9 days. And a plane landed in the airport there at Karachi that had Ted Lawson aboard, who had lost his leg, and several of the other boys who had been wounded during the Tokyo raid on the raid on Tokyo. And they put me on that plane, and we had sort of what you might call a leisurely flight back from Karachi to the States. They flew us up to Cairo, and because we were the walking wounded in this plane, we took about 3 days there and got to see a lot of the sights. By the time I got into that flight, I was feeling pretty good. I'd had my 9 days recovering from malaria in a hospital, and there were several other fellas who were among the wounded who were able to get around. We saw all the sights in Cairo. And we went from there down to the southern part of the Nile, to a city whose name I forget right now. Then we stayed there overnight and flew over to the western part of Africa and stayed a week in Accra. And we were able to swim there and see all the sights. This was a nice flight back. We flew over the southern Atlantic to Natal, and then back up on the Amazon River to a city where we stayed 2 or 3 nights. They were taking it leisurely because some of the boys were not in very good shape on this passenger list. And I was very fortunate. By that time I was feeling pretty good. Got up to Washington, D.C., and we were given 2 weeks vacation and new assignments to new groups. And I was assigned with 5 other of the Doolittle Raiders to a B-26 group training down in a field near Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Harding Field in southern Louisiana, B-26s. And that was in July. And we trained there all during July and August and into September. And late in September, we got our orders to head across the Atlantic to England. And first we flew up and landed at Fort Wayne, Indiana, maintenance base, where our...
This is an interview with Major Tom Griffin. We're going to discuss his contracting of malaria after the Doolittle raid, and then his experiences in North Africa and Sicily. So, Tom, if you would.
I told you how we left several crews with the newly formed 14th Air Force in China. The rest of us flew over the hump into India, and we left 4 crews with the 10th Air Force in India. The rest of us, about 30 some of us, got orders to return back to the States. Out of India, however, I contacted Malaria, and I was in I was down in Karachi. I was in Karachi when I went to the hospital with malaria. The first big sick, Calcutta. I was in Calcutta when I got sick. And by the time I got to Karachi, I was diagnosed as having malaria. And I was there in the hospital with malaria for about 9 days. And a plane landed in the airport there at Karachi that had Ted Lawson aboard, who had lost his leg, and several of the other boys who had been wounded during the Tokyo raid the raid on Tokyo. And they put me on that plane, and we had sort of what you might call a leisurely flight back from Karachi to the States. They flew us up to Cairo, and because we were the walking wounded in this plane, we took about 3 days there and got to see a lot of the sights. By the time I got into that flight, I was feeling pretty good. I'd had my 9 days recovering from malaria in a hospital, and there were several other fellas who were among the wounded who were able to get around. We saw all the sights in Cairo. And we went from there down to the southern part of the Nile, to a city which name I forget right now. Then we stayed there overnight and flew over to the western part of Africa and stayed a week in Accra. And we were able to swim there and see all the sights. This was a nice flight back. We flew over the southern Atlantic to Natal, and then up on the Amazon River to a city where we stayed 2 or 3 nights. They were taking it leisurely because some of the boys were not in very good shape on this passenger list. And I was very fortunate. By that time, I was feeling pretty good. I got up to Washington, D.C., and we were given 2 weeks vacation and new assignments to new groups. And I was assigned with 5 other of the Doolittle Raiders to a B-26 group training down in a field near Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Harding Field in southern Louisiana, B-26s. And that was in July. And we trained there all during July and August and into September. And late in September, we got our orders to head across the Atlantic to England. And first we flew up and landed at Fort Wayne, Indiana, maintenance base, where our engines and all were gone over, and planes were put in good shape. And then we flew out of there. They usually had 5 or 6 planes and crews ready to go every day, and we flew out with a group of 5 or 6 planes. We flew up to Labrador, and this was now in early October. And it was snowy enough, so we were snowed in Labrador for a couple of days. And then we flew to Greenland, a place called Bluey West 1, which was a maintenance base back down to at the end of a fjord. We landed there, and we were in this place in Bluey West 1, in southwestern Greenland, for about a week or 10 days. The weather was so bad, we couldn't get onto there. We were trying to take off and fly to Greenland, to Iceland. And we finally got out of there and flew over to Reykjavik. We landed in Reykjavik, and we stayed there because of weather conditions between Greenland or Iceland and England. We were weathered in there for about a week before we could take off. And we finally got a clear day and flew down to England, went into a field on the west side of England. And then in a day or two, they flew us over to Norwich on the eastern side of England. This was now around the first week of November. And during all of these flights of our group across Greenland and Iceland, we lost something like 8 or 9 planes and groups. They never flew a twin-engine bomber group that late in the season over the northern route because of the losses our group suffered in the terrible weather we encountered in those days. We lost a number of crews, planes and crews on that thing. We got down to England at Norwich, which was our base for almost a month. We were there from probably the first week of November.
1942.
1942. And the invasion of Africa came about the 10th, I think it was, of November, something like that. The 8th of November. And we had been gathering our crews together there and getting our planes in order and feeding them down to a field at Land's End. And they would take off whatever crews and planes were ready from Land's End and fly down to Oran. Now they flew from Land's End out over the ocean some distance from the French coast because the Luftwaffe had planes out over the ocean around that part of the ocean off of Europe, so that if we got in that part of the sky where they were in total command, we would be in a lot of trouble. So we went out in the ocean and back down to Oran in North Africa. And the Germans were flying over that part of the ocean off of France, and they had control there. So we flew down. We didn't even have our machine guns loaded or ready. We just had equipment in our planes as we flew down and landed at Oran. And we were there for about a week or so, and we flew up to Algiers. And we were in Algiers for some time, gradually feeding new arrivals from our group into our outfit.
What group was that, Tom?
That was the 317.
319?
319, the 319. B-26 medium bomb group. And we started flying combat against the Germans who were occupying places like Bizerta and Tunisia, and of course across Libya. And we had the British fighting the Germans in North Africa there, around Libya, fighting Rommel. And we were moved up then to Algiers and then to a place called Talergma. And we were in Talergma. Gradually more of our planes arrived with us, and we started flying combat against the Germans in Bizerta, in Tunisia. Tunisia, am I right? Yeah. Bizerta. And we flew combat against them. And we practiced what we call skip bombing, going in after the ships carrying supplies down to Rommel, ships coming out of Italian ports with supplies. Sometimes they would have, ships would have destroyers with them, and sometimes they were trying to make a run for it without any help except the speed of their ships and the guns they had on deck. And our job was to skip bomb these ships. It was the best way to get them. We practiced skip bombing out of a place called Biskra in the southern part of Algeria. We practiced skip bombing down there for several days, and then we went about these missions out over the Mediterranean. There were ships coming down from Italian ports bringing supplies to Rommel in North Africa, and we were skip bombing them, and we were having some success at that because you skip bomb these big bombs with delayed fuses into the side of these ships, giving you time to clear the superstructure. The trouble was, as you went in at about 50 feet, they had 50 caliber and 20 millimeter guns on their deck shooting at you, and you were going in shooting at them. Tracers were intervening. And I was on 3 of those missions. And on the 3rd mission, we were making a run on two Italian cargo vessels about 30 kilometers north of Bizerta. And we had 4 men, 4 B-26s in our search. 2 of us went for one of the freighters, and the other 2 went for the second freighter. And as we were going into our freighter, they shot us all up. A 20 millimeter went through the windshield of our plane on the run in and exploded between the pilot and co-pilot, and they were both wounded. On those missions, these skip bombing missions, I would go down in the nose where I had a 50 caliber machine gun and with tracer bullets, and I would sweep the deck of the freighter with these tracer bullets. The deck also had 50 caliber and 20 millimeter guns on the decks of these freighters shooting back at us. And on this 3rd mission I was on in the skip bombing business, a shell went in as we were making our run on the freighter. Shell went through the windshield and exploded between the pilot and co-pilot, and they were both wounded. There was this big explosion, and when I looked up there, their faces were covered with blood. They'd both gotten this shrapnel from these 20 millimeter that's exploded. And Charlie, the pilot of that, we were heading for the water from about 50 feet, and he pulled that thing out and got the blood out of his eyes. And Holly Grimm, his co-pilot, was wounded more seriously. He had pieces of shrapnel in his face and his arm. Anyway, we pulled that thing out right off the water and stayed airborne. We came off of that with one engine. All of our fluid was loose all over the place. Couldn't shut the bomb bays. We were on one engine, but we kept it in the air, and we flew down off of the North African coast on this one engine, heading back west to a field about 125 miles to the west of Bizerta called Bone, B-O-N-E, because that was the first place where there was a nice, smooth, sandy beach, and we wanted to get there and land the plane on that sandy beach. And as we headed that way, we had just one engine going. Bomb bay doors were open, we couldn't close, the hydraulic fluid was all gone. We were in sad shape. And we had 2 wounded guys up there. But We did have P-38s, the P-36s that flew cover for us, stayed with us until our one engine quit. And our one engine quit about a half an hour into that flight west, heading for that airstrip at Bone, or that sandy beach at Bone. And of course, as soon as that one good engine quit, we went in. And we ditched, and the heavy nose of the plane went under. There were 5 of us in the plane, we all got out. Now we had Charlie, the pilot, whose last name I can't think of. He was wounded, but he started swimming with a beautiful crawl stroke. But his co-pilot, Holly Grimm, was too badly wounded. And a pillow came up, and the top turret gunner and I were able to put Holly Grimm, lay him over that pillow. And there was a strap around it, and we each grabbed a hold of that strap and backstroked Holly in. Took us an hour and a half to get from where we ditched until we got to the shore. And we got to the shore, there were a bunch of Arab men that had seen us coming down. This was all rocky mountains, rocks right down into the water.
Yeah, that's right.
And they came down and helped us ashore. These Arabs, they did a good job for us. And all of us lived. Holly Grimm and our top turret gunner were both sent home after this. And Charlie, the pilot, and I stayed in combat. We both got a week off. I got a week off in Casablanca at a rest building hotel they'd taken over on the beach at Casablanca, and I had a week's rest there before I went back up to combat. That was in January. Am I getting my dates right? Yeah, that was in January.
1943?
Yeah. And then in about the last part of February, they found out our group was so shot up, they sent us back to Rabat to get all new crews, to build us back up to strength again. And we were back there March, April, and in May, we had all of these squadrons. The 4 squadrons were all built back up to strength, and we went back up again. And that's when we got back up there, Rommel's people had been defeated and driven out of Tunisia, and we moved up to Tunisia, and we started making raids against the German forces on Sicily. They had Sicily occupied. And we made missions against them until the 4th of July. And on the 4th of July, our group, which was, we had about 40 B-26s on a flight over the eastern part of Sicily. We were bombing German targets in the eastern part of Sicily. And there were about 40 planes, B-26s, in our group that day, and we were the lead plane in the group, and we were shot down. That was the 4th of July. And
how high were you when you were
we were at 10,000 feet when we were hit. And big flyer, everything was on fire. There was no hesitation, everybody got out. And we had the group commander, Colonel Ehring, in the plane. And Griff Williams was in the plane, and I was in that plane. And then we had top turret gunners, and we had waist gunners. We had about 8 or 9 in there. It was a funny thing, the enlisted men, the gunners, were captured by the Italians. And if you were captured by the Italian forces, you went to an Italian prison camp up in Italy, which was a good thing as it turned out, because this was July. In September, Italy surrendered, quit, and the boys that were in their prison camps were able to get out of there. Some of them got to freedom, some were recaptured by the Germans, but that's another story. Anyway, we got shot down now. It was the 4th of July, and the colonel was there, and Griff Williams and I, and a young kid we had as a bombardier. And they flew us up to Naples.
Well, you were on your way down though, and this guy was flying around you, wasn't he?
Oh yeah, I had that experience when I bailed out. Yeah, I bailed out, and we had, in some of our briefings after our missions, some of our guys would say, we saw German pursuits going, strafing our boys going down in their parachutes. So that was in my mind. And as I went down, an ME-109 came right at me, and he pulled up, just missed my chute. He came around, turned around, came back the other way. He probably made a half a dozen passes at me, and I was sure his guns were jammed. He was trying to get his guns unjammed. And so when I landed in a wheat field in Sicily, and the German soldiers were running across it. By the time I got the air collapsed out of my chute, it was a gusty, hot day. And I find he came over waggling his wings about 100 feet like that. What the hell's the matter with that guy? That afternoon, they took me into Catania, into a German general's office. And of course, I gave him my name, rank, and serial number. And I figured I hadn't anything to lose, so I said to this general, I said, Herr General, do you give permission to your pursuit boys to shoot us when we're coming down in parachutes? And I told him, I said, one of your pursuit guys was trying to get me and his guns were jammed. I told him the whole thing. He listened to me, he knew English, this German general. And he heard me out. And he said, I'll never forget, he said, Herr Hauptmann, he was not trying to shoot you, he was taking your picture. So it took the wind out of my sails. Apparently, this guy had this assignment for propaganda purposes. Go up and get a picture of an American coming down in the chute for propaganda, and he just happened to pick on me. So that was an experience I had there. And so they had us now. They had the colonel and me and Griff Williams and our bombardier. And the enlisted men that we had on this fight were all captured by the Italians. Now this was July. In September, 3 months later, the Italians surrendered, quit the war, and the boys in their prison camps were able to just run loose. Some of them were able to hide up until Americans showed up, and they were free. Others were recaptured by the British, who were coming down there to stop our landings on
Germans.
Germans.
Recaptured by the Germans.
By the Germans, yeah. So they took us, we were interrogated first in Naples, then later in Rome. They put us on trains in Rome. There was a German officer and 4 German soldiers in the party that guarded us. In other words, we got on trains, and there were compartments. And the German officer would sit in the compartment with the 4 prisoners, and the 4 German guards would be in the aisle right outside. So this is the way we went up to Germany. And didn't have much chance to jump off the train. They were right with us every inch of the way. We got up to Salak, which was a big interrogation center. And we were there about 2 or 3 days before, a couple days anyway, before they took us into the interrogator, the chief interrogator. And I think before you went before this interrogator, he had already made up his mind whether he was going to be tough on you or easy. And my experience was this, and Colonel Ehring had the same thing. I went in there and, hello, Captain Griffin, how's everything? And I said I can still remember. I was in this room, in this prison camp overnight. It was July. It was a hot, hot day. They had the radiators on, so hot you couldn't touch them. And I banged on the door, and when the guard would come, I wanted him to turn that radiator. He'd shut the door and walk away. And I sat up all night. It was about 120 degrees in that room. I was madder than hell by the time. And I told this German officer, he was going to be real nice to me. I said, I'm madder than hell. You leave those damn radiators on, we can't turn them off, and it's 120 degrees in there. And he said, Captain Griffin, I'll look into this. I had no idea it was like that. Give me all this bullcrap. He said, I'll look into that right away and find out why those radiators are turned off. It's a bunch of baloney. Yeah. And what they tried to do, they had to try to amaze you with what they knew about you. And he knew all about the group I was in. He knew what we'd been doing, and all the flights and everything. And he even asked me, what do you think about the war in the Pacific? When's it going to end? Well, I wasn't going to tell him. I knew that the Japanese at one time had wanted us because we were condemned to death over there, you know. And so I wasn't going to tell him I was on the Doolittle or anything about it. I said, hell, I don't know anything about the war in the Pacific. So that was the end of that. But actually, space, the only physical contact at that time Japan had with Germany were by submarines. And space was so limited, we weren't big enough shots to have taken up that room. I gotta go in here a minute.
Okay, one second.
Too much beer. How far do you want me to go on?
Well, we just you just told the captain, the interrogator, about the temperature and things, and
oh yeah,
and they asked you about the war in the Pacific.
Yeah. In other words, before you went in to sit before this guy, he had his mind made up whether he's going to be nice to you or tough on you. Now, of the 4 men they captured from our crew, the Germans, 3 of us, Colonel Ehring and Griff Williams and I, were treated nice. The young kid we had as a bombardier, they kept him for a week and they just raised hell with him. Just really put the screws on him to try to learn as much about our group as they could. He came into the outer locker where we were about a week later, and he could really beat up. I felt sorry for him. The 3 of us, the Colonel and Griff Williams and I, were treated fine, you know, just apologizing for the heat in our cell and all this kind of stuff. So that's the way they operated. It was a psychological thing, you know. They probably figured we're not going to get anything out of these guys, so we might have just as well let them go and get this kid,
Right.
Which they did. Raised hell with it.
So from there, where did they send you?
From there, we went to Stalag Luft 3, which is in Obersilesia, at a place called Sagen. It was the biggest German prison camp for the Air Corps men, Air Corps officers that they captured. They had, when we first got there, and when Davy Jones got there in December of 42,
43. Oh no, Davy Jones got shot down in 42.
In those days, the few Americans they'd captured were put in right with the British. But by the time that we got there, Griff Williams and I and Colonel Ehring, they had built another lager right south over the barbed wire from the British lager, and put all the American prisoners in there. And then as the months went on, they had what we called the West lager, which was the biggest of all. That ended up with about 6,000 men in there. When they would shoot down a B-17, if the men lived when they parachuted out, they'd have 4 officers, and they shot hundreds of those planes down, you know.
Right.
And that plus the pursuits officers they got. So they had they finally separated, so there were no Americans in with the British later. And the British were in the North Locker. That's where the Great Escape took place, where they had the big tunnels. And Davy Jones, which is one of our boys that was shot down early, was in with the British, and he did a lot of digging on those great tunnels that they had. And they finally broke one in April or March of '44 for the Great Escape. And but there were no Americans in the Great Escape because we were all in the lager just over the barbed wire to the south of them. But we felt that it was our duty to make it necessary for the Germans to have the maximum number of guards around to keep us in those places, and we were always figuring ways to get out. And digging tunnels was one, fake passes. There was even a time when we had two of our people dressed in German uniforms that led a group that was supposed to be a delousing group through the main gate of about 30 men, and these two prisoners dressed in German uniforms had a pass for the gatekeepers and marched these guys down the road outside the compound. They all broke and went their escape routes. They were probably all brought back, but it was just a matter.
Were these Americans?
Yeah, yeah. Just raised. We had guys with what they call hard-assing. In other words, they would go out at night, hoping that the huntfuhrers, the ferrets, came in at night with dogs, and we call them huntfuhrers. And those dogs, of course, could catch you pretty quick if you were out there. But you'd have to risk that they wouldn't catch you. You'd crawl to the barbed wire with barbed wire clippers and cut your way out. Some of our boys did that. That was another way to escape. And then we had the, that was about the best it was hard to get out of there, I'll say this. It was digging these tunnels was a hard thing. You had to disperse all this dirt.
Now you helped dig at one time part of the tunnel.
I dug some, yeah.
Tell me about that.
Oh, that was a scare. A lot of fellas from claustrophobia couldn't go down there. We went down 30 feet, so their sound equipment couldn't pick us up. 30 feet down, then out for several hundred feet. And we even had little railroads pulling this sand back and forth, back and for disposal. And we had hundreds of guys with things that hung over the neck down inside their pants with sand. They walk along, they pull the straps and put the dirt out on the flicks. And we had them working all the time. We had guys that were making passes that looked just like the printed pass. We had some very talented guys showed up on this work. But
now, what were you? Were you you were the head of the barracks? What do they call you? A blockhead or
Huntfuhrer?
Huntfuhrer.
Huntfuhrer, the head of the block. Yeah. I had. Well, of course, I got more in as the weeks and months went by, but I was on the end with my buddy John from Arkansas. John Beard.
Yeah, John Beard. Yeah.
Had this room down there, and we had a window and a door in the back end of our room. We had a double-decker bed there. The back end of our room, the artisans came in and moved the wall in about a foot, maybe about a foot, and it was on hinges. So you moved the double-decker, you could open this up, and it was a closet. We had civilian clothes in there, and maps, and any kind of escape equipment of any size, and that was.
Well, was it a false wall?
Huh?
Was it a false wall?
Yeah, we brought the wall that existed there. It was sort of a laminated material, just big sheets of that. Well, we just brought it in so that it had a board down the middle here, and that's where it opened when we got the bunk out of the way, and there was a closet. And by golly, they must have measured it and said, something's wrong here. And they found the damn thing. And John and I had to spend 2 weeks in the cooler. for destruction of Reich property. That was the charge against us. Destruction of Reich property. So that was I spent one month. I was given the assignment of working in the kitchen. You had these different food groups of about 6 men, and the kitchen, they had a big kitchen there where they made the soup or cooked the rutabaga or kartoffel and the potatoes and whatever they were handing out that day. And I was the prison representative down there for about a month because the fellow that had been doing it for some reason had to be off for a month. And I thought, oh boy, I'll learn how to speak German a lot better down here. What was that? I used to holler, fish bait, fish bait. It was short for fish bait. It says, how late is it? In other words, how ready should we be? I'd have to get the word out to the to the guys to come down to get their buckets filled with food. And that's all I had to do, fish bait. And I told this German officer when I got there, I'll never forget, I said, I finally got a chance, I'm going to learn how to speak German. And he said, from these guys, they're Berliners. They speak terrible German. You don't want to learn from them. Ah, man. Well, anyway, I had that experience. And then we got the YMCA and got athletic equipment into us. We had touch football games and softball, stuff like that in the spring and summer when the weather was good. So to try to keep the guys in as good a shape as we could. But the time finally came in January of 45. January of 45. They moved us out of there. The Russian forces had gotten to the Oder River, about 30 kilometers west or east of us. And it looked like they would, from the progress they'd been making, they would have reached our campsite in about 2 or 3 days. And they stopped at the Oder River, preparing for their final big push on Berlin. And so here they were, 30 kilometers from us, and they were bringing up all their new equipment for this big drive. And the Germans took stock of the situation. Here were almost 30,000 Allied air officer prisoners in this big camp where we were. And one cold winter night, out we went. And we walked in zero weather for, it was 3 days and 3 nights till we got to a place where there was boxcars, these old 40 and 8 boxcars. And they put us in those boxcars and got us down to Moosburg in Bavaria, where another camp, a camp that was built to handle about 5,000 men. And when this was in late January, we got there late January of 45, and February, March, April, 3 months we were there. And by the time the war ended, the end of April, there were about 30,000 at least in there. And think sanitation and think water. There are little spigots here and there where you could get water. And it was pretty bad. And they couldn't get enough food into us, so we got pretty hungry. The last 3 months were bad. But I don't think people starved to death. There's a lot of guys in pretty bad shape, but that's where we spent the last 3 months of the war. And then one day, the last day of April, Patton's men. Patton was driving up some miles north of us, driving towards the east, and he got to Nuremberg, and he sent a force down our way. And on the first day of May, or the last day of April, they came, a force of German SS troops were falling back before the Patton's men. And they had what we thought was a tremendous battle around our camp. but the Americans knew that this was a prisoner of war camp, and they were very careful about where their bullets were going, where they were aiming. And as a result of that, as far as I knew, only 4 prisoners in this huge compound were ever hit. And one of them happened to be a friend of mine, was struck by a stray bullet in the belly that day. He wasn't seriously injured, but it knocked him down, knocked the wind out of him. And it went into his stomach, but they were able to get the bullet right out there, you know, and got out all right. So they drove this force down past our camp to a river. The town of Moosburg is sitting on a river, and these SS forces blew up the bridge there. So Patton's men got down there into Moosburg, just south of us, a half a mile, and they had to bring bridge equipment to ford this river. And they told us just stay there. They would get food to us and all that. And I never forget, 2 other guys and I said, the heck with this. It was beautiful weather. By this time it was the 1st of May and warm and nice. And every morning we'd go out in the countryside and we'd walk all day long and get back to the prison camp that night. And on the way we'd stop in villages or homes anywhere, knock on the door, Essen. And we were a raggedy looking bunch. We just had rags on, you know, and they were scared to death. Some of them would just invite us right in, you know. Others would say, no food. They didn't have any food. And we'll say, we'll show you where it is. And we go back in their kitchen, and they had, of course, they had these big loaves of bread, and they had butter and all kinds of wonderful food as far as we were concerned. Right. So we ate like kings. We had 3 good meals a day back in there with these people. They were scared to death of us, you know, naturally. We looked like hell. Mm-hmm. And we did that every day. We'd get back to the prison camp that night. No changes. They'd gotten some white, after a couple of days, they'd gotten a lot of white bread into the camp, and everybody was happy. But that's all they'd gotten for 2 or 3 days. See, they had so much other stuff to do that they just couldn't feed all these people. And so we just kept going out there, wandering around, and had quite a time. Well, those are the last days. Finally, they came one day. Well, they deloused us, for one thing. I can remember seeing a line of guys as long as you could see. And we took these rags off, and they put this powder. We were all just covered with this white powder. It killed the lice and whatever we had on us, you know. Mm-hmm. We had a lot of bad stuff on us. And then we marched on and got new clothes to put on, khaki pants and stuff, you know, just something to cover. And then after they got us deloused, they put us in trucks and took us up to Regensburg and flew us from Regensburg to Le Havre. Le Havre is where the great camps were, the cigarette camps, Lucky Strike, Chesterfield. Thousands of men, prisoners from all over Europe, were fed into there. And the first day you were there, you got a ticket, a blue ticket. That allowed you to get food in this big tent where they practically baby food for several days, pap, you know. Right. And of course we'd been eating all kinds of stuff before that, the countryside up there. Then you'd get a red ticket. You got a different kind of diet for several days. That's the way they did this thing. Mm-hmm. And I remember not one thing there, piles were so rife. With the food we did get from the Germans, there were so many men suffering, including me, from piles. And they had this examination. You go down, and if you had it, there was so much of that, they had limited in how much supplies they had to help people with this problem. And I thought surely I was in a bad, sad shape. He looked over at me, "You're okay. They didn't have enough medicine for everybody." And I thought, I was bound to get their medicine. Right. You're all right. So some guys must have been in awful shape to get their medicine. I couldn't get it. So that was our experience there. And then after, I guess, a couple of weeks, we they took us down to the wharfs there at Le Havre, put us on a ship. And in our case, instead of going right to New York, we were at sea for 17 days altogether. We went down to the Caribbean. 1,500 men from the ship we were on disembarked, and we took 1,500 men that had been maintaining an airfield there for practically the whole war, and they were way overdue to get off there. So those 1,500 got on, and then we went up to New York. 17 days at sea, and they wouldn't let any of us off the ship down in the Caribbean.
Oh.
We had to stay on the ship. Just the ones that were being switched got off the ship.
Yeah.
We had to stay on. But they fed us well. That was an interesting thing. This big boat, the kitchen went 24 hours a day. Time to eat. You had a ticket which permitted you to enter the dining room at a certain time. And there were men scheduled to eat at the different times, 24 hours a day. The kitchen never stopped feeding people. It's just a constant feeding going on in that boat. Think of the planning for that.
Yeah.
And the food wasn't bad. Of course, to us, we thought anything was pretty good. But that's the story.
Well, I appreciate that. So now you're back in New York, and the war is over.
Yeah.
We thank you for this interview, Tom, and appreciate it very much.
That was the end of the war.
This is a continuation of an interview with Major Tom Griffin. And Tom, if you would, start off right after you cut yourself out of the tree, out of the bamboo tree there in China, and how you ran across the Chinese, or they ran across you, and how they helped you and where they took you.
Okay, well, this was about 12:30 at night local time, and the flight from the carrier till we ran out of gas was 15 and a half hours of flight. It was a storm I bailed out in, and I came to rest at the foot of this tree with my chute hung up in the tree and the shroud lines just allowing me to reach the ground. I disengaged I couldn't get the chute out of the tree, so I just disengaged my harness, parachute harness, and walked away from it. Now, this was a stormy night. It rained all this night, and I tried to I was on a steep hillside, and I tried for an hour to find a level place to lie down, and I never found one. The forest in this mountainside was made up of bamboo trees, about as big as 10 or 12 inches in diameter. And I ended up sitting with my feet braced down on the bank of one tree, and leaning back on the terrain behind me. So I was practically standing up for the rest of the night and never did go to sleep. In the morning, I headed down the mountainside, and I ended up at the head of a series of rice paddies as far as the eye could see. I was right up at the top part of these rice paddies, and as I started down, after about a half an hour or so, I came across one of my crew, and the two of us continued on down, and we picked up a third member of our crew in these rice paddies. And we continued all that day walking through this part of the countryside. The Chinese farmers that did see us were frightened and ran away, but there was one hut or house that we stopped in, and we indicated we were hungry. And believe it or not, the farmer took us in and gave us each a bowl of rice. That was the first kind thing done by the Chinese to us. He had no idea who we were, of course. as we continued down through that farmland, we finally went into up to a house and indicated to the farmer that we would like to dry off. We were soaking wet. It had rained all this day. And he took us into a room. This was a large farmhouse complex, and he had a room at the far end of the complex with a dirt floor, but with a furnace in there, a stove. And we got in there, and we were standing around drying off our clothes when the farmhouse was surrounded. Apparently the warning had been put out to the Chinese military in that area that these three weird-looking characters were roaming over the countryside, and they finally caught up with us, surrounded this farmhouse, and literally took us prisoner. They didn't know who we were, had no idea. And we looked up from where we were drying our clothes off at the stove and saw that there were guns pointing at us from every door and window in the place. And in the doorway, there was the man who was obviously the Chinese officer in command of these fellows, and he had a pistol and a scroll with Chinese writing on it, which probably was a warrant for our arrest, I suppose. And I went up to him and gave him the Chinese that we were taught to give, Lushu Megwa Fuji, which was supposed to mean I am an American, and it didn't mean anything to this Chinese officer. And I later found out that the Chinese language was such at that time, before radio and television, so that if you got 50 or 60 miles away from your homestead, the chances are the Chinese wouldn't understand you. The whole country of China was a mixture of dialects and things. So we were prisoners of these fellows. We weren't absolutely sure whether they were Chinese or Japanese. We just simply couldn't tell. They were Chinese, they were soldiers, and they walked us for about 3 hours to their barracks, and we stayed there overnight. We had reason to believe now that these were Chinese, because when we went into the barracks at one end, there was a big picture of Chiang Kai-shek and Chou En-lai, the head of the Chinese. And so we were reasonably sure that these people that were holding us were Chinese. The next morning, they marched us down to a town, and we were way up in the mountains now in Kiansi province, which is the second province in from the ocean. And it was Chinese occupied territory. The province along the coast, Chikian province, was occupied by the Japanese. But the province where we got further inland, 300 miles inland, further than the other people did, of our people. And we went, they took us down to this town, and there were some American men there who ran a school and a hospital from St. Louis, a religious order. And of course, we talked to them, and they identified us, and then everything was fine. The two other members of our crew came in within the next week into this village. Doc Watson had broken his shoulder when he bailed out, and the other fellow had gotten away from some Chinese bandits. But after about a week, we had our whole crew of 5 men together in this village. And the Chinese sent in a military unit of about 15 men and an officer, and they put Doc Watson on a stretcher. And he was a big man, about 240 pounds. And wherever possible, there would be 4 Chinese carrying this stretcher with Doc on it. And it took us 2 days over the mountains to get to the nearest highway. The Chinese in this village up in the mountains had destroyed the roads so that the Japanese could not come in there any other way than on foot. They couldn't get any trucks or tanks or anything like that into this village because the roads were destroyed. And so we got out after about 2 days of walking over the mountains to the nearest big highway. And there the Chinese had a station wagon for us, and we headed across China westward until we got to a village in about the center of China at a place called Lingling. There's a big river there and a big-sized city, and we were put up into the dormitories of what had been a Chinese girls' school. The school was not operating at this time, and we stayed there for about 2 weeks altogether, and gradually over these 2 weeks, more and more of our boys that had been liberated from the Japanese in Jiangxi province, where they had bailed out, were being fed west into China. And we finally had quite a number of our people at this city at Lingling. And after about 2 weeks, the Japanese incidentally knew where we were and bombed the airport at Lingling every night, every day, to try to prevent our getting out of there. But the Chinese had a system of thousands of people would go, of their workers would go over the airport after an air raid and fill up all the bomb holes, and within a half an hour after the Japanese attack, the airport would be usable again. And after about 10 days, a DC-3 came in from Chongqing and landed, and we all piled on, and it flew us to Chongqing. Now, we were there in Chongqing for perhaps a week or 10 days, and in that time they started forming what was later to become known as the American 14th Air Force in China. They were just getting it together. About 4 or 5 of our crews were left there with this newly formed 14th Air Force. The rest of us went down first to Kunming, where the Flying Tigers were, and we flew out of there over the hump into India, and we left about 4 or 5 of our crews with our 10th Air Force in India. See, these Doolittle Raiders were being spread all over the place. We never flew together, of course. And about 30 or so of us got orders to fly back to the States. And I got into the plane with the people ordered back to the States because I was held up in a hospital in Karachi because I had malaria. And when the plane landed with our people that were flying back to the States, they had a lot of the wounded, and Ted Lawson, for example, who had lost his leg, was on the plane, and several of the other boys who had been hurt. So they picked me up out of the hospital where I had malaria in Karachi, and we flew back to the States. Because this were a bunch of walking wounded in this plane, they took it easy. We spent about 3 days in Cairo, and then we went down to Anglo-Egyptian Sudan and across Africa, and stayed there about on the Atlantic coast in Africa for about a week. And they just took it easy because most of the people in the plane were walking wounded. And we flew over to Natal in Brazil, and up on the stayed up on the Amazon River at a place called I forget the name of the town. Anyway, we were there about 3 or 4 days, and then we got back to the United States. We'd gone completely around the world, and we got up to Washington D.C., where we were given 2 weeks off, and then assigned to new groups being trained and formed in the States.
Now, Tom, when you were in China, did you meet Madame Chiang Kai-shek?
Yeah.
Where did you meet her at?
Well, about 6 or 8 of us happened to be in the Chinese headquarters at Chongqing one day, and Madame Chiang Kai-shek came in. Or anyway, we were invited to go to her home. for lunch. And so, of course, we went over to her home, and she had been educated in the United States, and of course she spoke much better English than we did. She was quite a lady, and she was our hostess for lunch there that day. And while we were eating lunch, the Generalissimo came in with an interpreter. He didn't speak English. And after the luncheon, we went out to the living room of the home, and the Generalissimo pinned Chinese medals on us for our having bombed the Japan. And we had a day there with her and got to meet her. And
She signed her autograph for you too?
pardon?
Did she give you her autograph also?
Yes, she did. As we were leaving, she asked if she said if we had any paper for her to write on, she'd be happy to sign her autograph. And I had a little address book. I think I showed you that address book.
Yes, you did.
And she put in Mei Ling Sung. She was one of the three Sung sisters. And she had Mei Ling Sung in English, and then the Chinese characters for her name.
Who did her sisters marry?
Pardon?
Who did Mei Ling Sung's sisters marry?
Oh, the older sister married Sun Yat-sen, who was the first president of the Chinese Republic in about 1912 or 13 when it was set up. And then the third sister married a fellow whose name, of course, escapes me right now, who was in the Chiang Kai-shek government.
Yeah.
He spoke English, and he went over. He was the treasurer of Chiang Kai-shek's government there in China. And he and Mei Ling came to the United States in sometime in 1942 or 43. And she made a talk at a combined Congress, Senate and House, and was a big hit, and told our Congress how much money they needed to build up their forces, money and supplies, and she helped the Chinese cause a great deal because our people went overboard for her and did all we could to help the Chinese from that time on. You know, we gave them a lot of money and supplies, and we fed supplies over the Himalayas into China. And
Speaking of money, weren't you given a lot of Chinese money?
yeah. This particular officer that came in with this bunch of about 12 or 15 soldiers to get us out of this village up in the mountains over to a road where they could take us west into China, had been authorized, had been given 500,000 Chinese yuans, and he gave 100,000 yuans to each one of us. Now this was a lot of money, and this was China at its most depressed time. Now this money, I don't know exactly what it was worth for $1, but I made 2 purchases with these yuans. The stores were practically out of goods of any kind in the villages or cities where we ended up. But I can remember I bought a pencil that cost me about 6 yuans, and a little notebook. I wanted to keep some notes of what was happening. And the pencil in this little pocket notebook was 14 yuan, so you can get an idea about what a nickel.
You had 100,000.
And it had 100 big wads. Well, one day what happened, we found as we headed west into China that there wasn't much you could buy that you wanted. And we came to this one river, and we were waiting for the ferry to come across to pick up our car to cross. There was no bridge there. We had to get on this ferry to cross this river. And while we were waiting, a Chinese beggar came up asking for money, and he had his hands cuffed up like this. And one of the 5 of us, I don't know which one it was, pulled out his wad of yuans and gave it to the old beggar. And we each did the same thing. We piled our yuans, and the old beggar was standing there with 500,000 yuans in his hands, and he never moved. He just looked at him. And we got on that ferry, and I can remember looking back, and he was still out on that pier, looking at his money. All of a sudden, from being the poorest man in the village, he was the richest. And we probably ruined his life with all this money. I don't know whatever happened to him, but I'll never forget that.
You were talking about a car. What kind of a car did they pick you up in?
It was a station wagon. It might have been a Ford station wagon.
That's what I thought it was. I thought you said it was.
That's what they drove our crew. Now, some of the others, where they picked up more of our boys, they got them on buses and took them till we got to Lingling, till they got to Lingling. But we were in this car until we got there. Then we flew out of there to Chongqing.
Right.
And we flew from there down to Kunming, where the Flying Tigers were, left some of our boys in both places, and over the hump into India. At Calcutta, we left about 4 or 5 guys with the 10th Air Force,
Right.
4 or 5, about 4 or 5 crews.
Right. I want to ask you something else, and this is jumping ahead to when you were at Stalag Luft 3. You said that you did have some black pilots at Tuskegee.
Had some what?
African American black pilots. They came in.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Would you go into some detail about what happened with the black pilots there at the POW camp in Sagan,
Yeah,
Germany?
should I go into that now?
Yeah, if you would, please. Yeah.
At Stalag Luft 3, there were, as a matter of fact, when I was flying out of North Africa, there was this Colonel, I can't think of his name now, on Cape Bone, and he had his pursuit outfit there, flying P-40s, I believe. Can you remember his name? The colonel that was he became a general, the black colonel.
B.O. Davis.
Huh?
Benjamin
Davis,
O.
yeah,
Davis.
Davis was there. He's a colonel when
Yes.
I met him there.
Right. Oh, you did meet him.
Yeah, we landed, our plane, I don't know why, we got into some kind of a scrape where our plane had to land on Cape Bone, and they were there.
Right.
And we met some of those fellas, and the Colonel Davis was there too, just to say hello, that's all.
Yeah.
He later became a general,
Yes.
one of the big, we were always happy to know when we were flying over most of the time against the German forces in Sicily, sometimes in Sardinia. We were always happy to know that these fellows were flying covers for us, because they were real good at that, and they kept the German pursuits off of our tails very well. So we were always happy to see them. They did a good job. Mm-hmm. So much for that. Now, where else did you want me to go with this?
After you were a POW, you had a few of the black pilots that were captured brought to your barracks.
Oh, yeah. When
And you had some problems, I think.
Yeah. Some of them were flying out of England, and I think some of them might have been coming up from the south. I'm not sure.
From Italy. Yeah.
We didn't get many of these as prisoners, but we got a few. And as prisoners were fed into our prison lager, for example, each building would get its share of whatever was coming in. And I got, early on, I got one fellow who was an excellent, he came in, he was a very, very fine lieutenant who had been shot down, no problem at all. And it just happened that the room that was to take him first was a bunch of boys from Harvard and Yale, a bunch of boys, that birds of a feather flocked together. This room of about 8 or 10 men were all from Eastern colleges there. I brought him in, introduced him, and said, he's your roommate, and there was never a word. About probably a month or 6 weeks later, I got my second one. Now this fellow, he was nervous, I'm sure. But I took him down to the next room that was due for a prisoner, was a bunch of boys from Louisiana and Texas. There were about 14 in there at the time. And I took him in, and this fellow, he was nervous. And he talked too much and he talked too loud. And I couldn't say anything to him. But these guys just decided they couldn't stand him. And they came down to my room and said, "You got to get him out of there." I said, "This guy is an officer in the United States Air Force. He's been shot down in combat. He's a prisoner of war, and he is authorized to stay wherever I put him." And I let it go. They went out, and it was either the next day or something. Another delegation came down from the room and said, "We're going to kill him." The fellow, I knew he was talking too loud. I couldn't tell him how to act or anything like that, but he was a little talking too loud and too much. But that was beside the point. He was entitled to do that. So they came down again, and I said, "Well, you kill him, you know, I'll be darn sure that after when this ends, you will be tried for murder." And they roared out of my place, and I got thinking, why? Under these conditions, why should we go on with this? You know, it was terrible for the black fellow in there, and so I went back to this room where I put the first one that came into my building, and I said, "Bad situation down there. Will you take him?" They said, "Sure." I brought him down. That was the end of the whole thing. Never heard another word.
Yeah. Well, that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's terrible that they were treated that way by some of the guys.
But I had to back down.
Yeah. Well,
in a way, I always regretted that.
Yeah.
But it was the best solution at that time.
Yeah. Well, you did the best thing for him, and you did the best thing for yourself too, even though you somewhat regret it, but it was the right thing to do.
So, where do you want me to go from here with this? Is this being recorded?
Yes.
Okay. Where do
you told me once that you had done a bond drive.
did what?
That you had done a bond drive where you were raising money for the bonds?
Yeah, when I came back from overseas, see, I'd had malaria, and I came back in Washington, D.C. We got 2 weeks leave. And then they said they wanted me to go around and speak at different places, dinners and breakfasts and things all over the Midwest. I spoke in Chicago, Milwaukee, the capital of New York,
Albany.
Albany. I spoke there, and Washington, D.C. I spoke at the breakfasts and lunches and dinners selling war bonds. And they had me doing that for, I don't know, a month, I guess, just going around. I got awful tired of it. Mm-hmm. I know that. But they wanted these bonds to be sold, and I guess it did help to sell them. So they had me do that. Then I was assigned to a B-26 Marauder group down in Louisiana, Hardingfield, Louisiana. And I got down there in late July or August, sometime like that. I'm not just sure. Mm-hmm. And we trained down there. It was hot. Boy, it was hot down there. In August and September, the end of September, the group was ready to go, and they started us out. It's a B-26 Marauder group now. And they sent us the northern route. And this was the last time they ever sent a twin-engine bomber group, twin-engine, the northern route that late in the season, because we had an awful time. We had an awful experience. And can you break it off now? We trained down at Hardingfield, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and at the then we flew up at the end of September. We flew up to Terre Haute, not Terre Haute, Fort Wayne. We flew up to Fort Wayne, where our engines were going over, and they did some work. And as they checked out each plane, it was ready for the flight over the Atlantic. We left there usually in groups of about 5 or 6 planes. And the first stop was in Maine. We stayed overnight there, and then we went up to Goose Bay, Labrador. Now this was the 1st of October, and we stayed 2 or 3 days at Goose Bay because it snowed, and this was just the start of winter up there. And we got off after about 3 days, and we flew up to Greenland, a place called Bluey West 8, which was it was Bluey West 1. In the southwestern part of Greenland, and we flew down this fjord, and here was a big opening where the glacier ended, and big hunks of ice broke off and became icebergs and floated out of there. That was where we got in there in early October, and we were weathered in there for about 10 days before we could get out of there. The weather was so bad. And we had a good time. We fished and all that kind of stuff. And we finally got out of there. And we flew to Reykjavik, Iceland. And here again, the weather was so bad, we couldn't get off on our final trip to England for about a week before the weather. Mm-hmm. And gradually others of our crew, when this whole thing was over, we discovered that we had lost about 6 planes and 6 crews to this terrible weather.
When you say lost, you mean they're dead?
They were gone. They had gone down somewhere, and they were never recovered. They're just simply gone. They never sent a twin-engine bomber group over the northern route this late in the season after the experience they had with our group. We lost those 6 planes and 6 crews, and we lost them.
You were lucky again, weren't you?
Yeah. So now we were in England, Norwich, England. And that was sometime in October. And about the 10th or 12th of November, the invasion of North Africa. And we were ordered down there. Now here again, we fed planes and crews as they were ready to go. Our group commander, Colonel Rutherford, took off with about 5 planes one day. The idea was to go to Land's End, stay overnight there, and then fly down off of the European coast till you got down to southern Spain and cut through where the Rock of Gibraltar is. Mm-hmm. In our case, they were sending us to Oran. Now, these guys took off from our field there at Norwich, and apparently there was about 5 planes in this, and there was a big thunderstorm. And they decided rather than to fly through that, they were flying down to Land's End. I heard this later from one of the crew members that ended up in prison camp with me. Mm-hmm. They decided to go around it, and they weren't watching where they were going. They weren't over the wide spaces of the United States. Right. They broke into the clear at 5,000 feet over the Brest Peninsula, mm-hmm. the most heavily defended piece of real estate in Europe. The Germans shot them down, all 5 of them. 4 crews, they were all killed. One crew, the plane was so badly disabled, he was able to get it down and land on the beach there. And that's why I was able to talk to a crew member in prison camp about what happened that day, and I learned what went wrong. Killed all those people, including our group commander.
Oh boy!
And because somebody had his head locked up there, navigating that lead plane.
Right.
Yeah. So that was what happened there. Now we fed our planes down to Land's End, and we flew out in the ocean from there because the Luftwaffe covered the I guess it's called the Bay of Biscay off of the French coast. Mm-hmm. And if you got near there, the Luftwaffe would hop all over you and shoot you down. Now we were flying with our stuff all packed in there, our 50 caliber machine guns in the turret or the nose gun. We weren't even armed. We weren't looking for combat. We were just carrying our equipment and ourselves down to Oran. So we were way out in the ocean. Now Doolittle actually flew down there in 2 planes at one time in the same time period. Eisenhower was in one plane, Doolittle in another. Eisenhower and some of his staff, and Doolittle happened to be in another one, B-17s, and they were hopped by the Luftwaffe because they got too close, too soon. And they almost shot him down. They didn't succeed in shooting him down, but the co-pilot of the plane Doolittle was on was wounded, and Doolittle took the
Control
flight, his place. And they got down there. That was something that happened that was always kept very quiet. But all those big leaders of our force almost got shot down before they got down there that day.
Oh my God! Yeah.
So we got to Oran, and we were there for a few days. The weather was miserable. I remember it was raining all the time. Then we flew up to I should have a map out with the names of these places. The big city halfway down Africa.
Tunisia,
Uh,
Bizerta,
where?
Bizerta, Tunis.
Yeah, well, we got to Tunisia, but first we were in, I ought to have that map.
Bizerta,
Where?
not Bizerta.
No, well, we were in Bizerta, but see, it's so silly because these are such well-known places that they just don't come to me. I'm handicapped.
That's all
Let me get a map. I can do this better if I have a map.
Okay, we're back. I think we're back now. I think that city you said was
Algiers.
Algiers.
Yeah, we were there first. We started flying combat for a short time out of Algiers, and then we moved up to a place called Talergma, and we flew out of Talergma. This is in Algeria. For some time, and we were flying against the Germans in Tunisia and Libya. And after the Germans were defeated there, we moved up to Tunisia, to the city of Tunis, and we were flying against the Germans in Sicily until July. We were flying against the Germans in Sicily, and then I got shot down over Sicily and captured by the Germans on the 4th of July of '43.
What city was that? Did you get shot down over? What city did you get shot down over?
Near Catania.
Catania.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We were bombing targets, airfields in Catania on the 4th of July of '43, and we didn't know at the time we were shot down, but a week later, our forces invaded Sicily. We knew that some big movement was going to take place because all of these ports were full of troop carriers and things like that. They were going to do something. They were going to invade this place. But we were shot down and captured a week before the invasion and taken up to Germany.
This is backing up a little bit, but when this whole mission first started with the Doolittle Raiders, you were called up to Washington, D.C. before you left.
Yeah, Davy Jones and I.
Yeah, tell me about that, would you?
Yeah, Davy Jones. This was in.
Who approached you?
Pardon?
Who approached you to go to?
Oh, Doolittle.
Oh, did he?
Oh, yeah, Doolittle sent Davy Jones and me up there. That was in early February. We were down in Florida now at Eglin Field where we were training.
Right.
And he sent, see, we had to have maps and we had to have target information, exactly where targets were. And so he sent Davy Jones and me up there. We worked with Air Force intelligence, for over a week, probably about 10 days. And what we accomplished was this. We got maps of the Japanese islands for 20 crews, enough for 20 crews, and maps of China for 20 crews. And we also got target information, the exact location of military or industrial targets that we could use in the Japanese islands. And we had all of that crated up sufficiently to give a set of maps and target informations to 20 crews. That's how many we were training, getting ready for this. And this was all very secret. The Air Force Intelligence Office where we went were told to simply work with us and cooperate, get what we needed. They didn't know what we were getting it for. And it was all very secret. And Davy Jones and I got all that together. And then it was crated up. We flew down to Eglin Field with that. And of course that got on the carrier with us in San Francisco the 1st of April. And as we went across the Pacific, each crew was given a specific target that they were to hit in Japan. And these maps and all this information were given out on board the carrier. That's how that worked.
Tell me about running into the other Doolittle Raider there in Washington that ended up going to Russia, and you always thought he might have been ordered to.
Oh, the crew that went to Russia.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I've always argued that. One of our 16 crews that hit targets in Japan said he looked at, and the fellow that did this, pilot, was the only West Pointer in the Doolittle Raider group. Ski York was a West Point graduate. He was a captain. And by an odd coincidence, I tell you something else that happened. When Davy Jones and I were in Washington, D.C., we stayed at this hotel, which names I can't think of now. But one night, here was Ski York and his co-pilot. At our we were going to dinner in the dining room there.
Right.
And what the dickens are you doing here? Oh, we had some work we had to do here. We had dinner together. They were very tight-lipped about what they were there for. But I am sure, I don't think it was ever even written up, but I think that Ski York was told, you bomb your target in Japan, fly up to Vladivostok and see what the Russians do towards greeting you. And the Russians at that time, in the spring of 1942, had their hands full with the Germans on the Western Front.
Right.
And they didn't want to have any trouble with Japan at that time. So they took over Ski York and his crew and in effect put them under house arrest for over a year. They moved them, they took the plane, they never saw the plane again, but the Russians moved them from one part of Russia to another for about 14 or 15 months. And at the end of that period, they were down in the part of Russia which is just north of what was then called Persia. It's called Iran now. Mm-hmm. And the boys, in order to stay busy to do something rather than just be in house arrest, had volunteered to work. And they were actually put to work doing something in a factory down there. And they got some Russian people to help them. And one night they spirited them over the border into what was then Persia. It's Iran now, and they were free. But they were actually held for 15 months by the Russians. See, they didn't want the Japanese to get jumping on their tail at that time. So that was the story with those folks.
Well, I thank you for that interview this evening. Maybe we can get together again on some other topics. And thank you again.
Thank you, sir.
This is an interview with Major Tom Griffin on September the 7th, 2007. And this particular interview will have to do with Tom's experiences in the 12th Air Force in Africa.
Yes.
Tom, if you would, I'd like to just discuss what happened after you were shot down when you were skip bombing, how you were rescued, and just some detail about that.
Okay. There were 4 planes in our sea sweep looking for freighters bringing supplies down to Rommel in North Africa. And up about 30 miles north of Bizerta, we ran into two cargo vessels, Italian cargo vessels, heading south, obviously with supplies for Rommel. That's where he was getting his supplies. So we split up. Two of us went after one of the cargo vessels and two went after another. And as we went in about, on these skip bombing missions, at about the level of the deck, the top deck of the supply ship. And they were shooting, of course, shooting at us with 20 millimeters and 50 caliber, and we were shooting at them with 50 caliber. And as we went in, just about at the point where the bomb was going to be released to skip into the side of the freighter that we were making our run on, we had 4-second delayed fuses on these bombs going at 170 miles an hour. We had practiced this down in the desert at Biskra in southern Tunisia, or Algeria, down in the desert country. And with 4 or 5 second delayed fuses, it gave us time to clear the superstructure of the ship before it exploded. But this time I think it exploded right under us, because we came out of the bomb run on one engine, all our hydraulic fluid gone. We couldn't close the bomb bay doors, and the shell had come in the through the windshield and exploded between the pilot and co-pilot, and wounded both of them. And when I looked up from, during this kind of a run, I would go down in the nose and man a 50 caliber machine gun with tracers and sweep the deck of the enemy cargo ship we were making a run on. And after this big explosion, I looked back and both of their faces were covered with blood. It was a bit of a tense moment. And that pilot pulled the plane out before we went in, and we leveled off at about 10 or 15 feet above the water. He got the blood out of his eyes and he continued to fly the plane on one engine. Bomb bay doors were open, he couldn't close them. We'd lost all of our hydraulic fluid. And he kept it in the air, and I went back and I started taking care of the co-pilot, who was wounded, much worse than the pilot. He had flak all down his right side, and his face was covered with little pieces of flak. One got in his left eye, which bothered him the rest of his life. And we were still in the air, and I told Charlie Myers, if you keep the plane in the air, we fly down fly west along the Algerian coast there. The mountains came right down to the water, and there was no place to land for about 120 miles, where there was a town called Bone, B-O-N-E, and they had a nice, smooth, sandy beach at Bone. That was the only place, the first place to possibly land on land. So we headed west, and we were flying along just above the water, maybe 50 feet above the water. And our P-38s, about a half a dozen of them that had accompanied us on this, were flying around with us, sticking with us. And our good engine quit. After about, a half hour or so, we were maybe 100 miles or 90 miles west of Bizerta. And up to that point, the Atlas Mountains come right down to the water. There's no place to land on land. And so when our good engine quit, we went in. And we all got out. The plane went right under. And in my case, I didn't put the safety belt on because I was afraid if something happened and I wasn't conscious, I couldn't get it open. So I just jammed my head up against my parachute over my desk. And the water, as the plane went down, the water rushed in. And the last thing I remember was this wall of water driving me back. It knocked me out against the bulkhead back here. And when I came to, I was underwater, But we had opened the hatch in my compartment there, and that's where guys got out. And they hatch over the pilot and co-pilot, so those guys got out. And when I came up, I had a big bump on my head where I'd been driven back. And the other 4 guys were there. 2 of them had been wounded now, the pilot and the co-pilot. And the pilot, not wounded as badly, he started swimming in, and I told the bombardier to swim with him to help him, and then the top turret gunner and I put Holly Grimm, the co-pilot, over a pillow that came up, and we each, there was a strap that went around that pillow, and we each grabbed that and backstroked him in. Took us an hour and a half to backstroke Charlie Grimm in.
Holly Grimm. Holly Grimm.
Holly Grimm, yeah, Holly Grimm. And when we would rest from time to time, we could see the Arabs in their long white robes, a bunch of Arab men down at the seashore there waiting for us to come in. We didn't know what kind of a greeting we were going to get. But it turned out they were friendly and they helped us. When we finally got right in there, they helped us up on the rocks and things. And it would have been awfully hard, but we were so pooped out by then to get on shore. But we went, they carried Holly Grimm up to a stone hut they had up about 100 yards up the hillside there. And we all got up in there. And the Arabs, I couldn't speak French, but Charlie Myers could speak French. And so he spoke to the Arabs, and they said there was a French lookout post several miles down the coast towards Bizerta, that way, towards the east and towards the west. And so when we got organized, I headed with one of the Arabs down the mountainside. It took us about an hour or 2 to get to this place. And by that time it was dark. And the French Marines had this post there, and they were there to see. They were in contact constantly with the British Army right over the mountains. The British Army right over the mountains was fighting a Nazi army which was trying to hold them out of Bizerta. That's the state of the war right there in that part. And this French outpost that we went to was in constant communication with the British Army. So
what month was this, Tom?
This was January of 42, of 43, of January of 43. Right. Late January. It was about the 25th, something like that of January. And we got there, and of course my Arab friend was able to tell him about our situation. And one of the French men from this detachment came with us with bandages and disinfectant and stuff like that, because I told him there were 2 wounded down there. So that was, and we walked back, and he took care of them. The next day, now these Frenchmen had notified the British Army on the other side of the Atlas Mountains that this American air crew was there and in need of help. And about 10 or 11 o'clock the next morning, here came a bunch of British soldiers, half a dozen or more, and they had medical supplies and things like that. They'd heard that Charlie Myers was able to ride on a mule that they brought. But they made a stretcher for Charlie Grimm. Not Charlie Grimm.
Holly Grimm.
Holly Grimm. And put him on the stretcher. And it took some hours for us to get over that mountain with these guys. They had Holly in a stretcher, and Charlie did pretty well.
How did you transport him? Did you carry the stretcher, or did they have a mule?
They carried a stretcher.
Oh, okay.
2 men at a time. Because it was narrow going, some ledges and things. This was mountainous terrain until we got over those mountains, down to where the British headquarters were. And when we got there, they took immediate steps to help these two wounded boys we had. And the British, over a period of some weeks after that, the Germans were defeated in North Africa, in that part, you know, and they were either captured or they got out of Tunisia. And I don't know what else to tell you except that of the five of us, Holly Grimm and the top turret gunner, who had a little mental problem after all this, they were sent home, and I was kept in action, as was Charlie Grimm when he got well.
Well, so that was the end of January. So now we're into February of 1943.
Mm-hmm.
What plane were you flying when you did those skip bombing runs?
B-26.
B-26.
Right.
How many engines is on that?
Twin engine. That's a twin engine bomber.
I see.
Single tail.
Single tail.
Marauder, yeah.
Okay.
The B-25 has the double tail.
Are they basically the same plane? Then?
Well, they're twin engine bombers.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
That's the only.
Both of them.
Yeah. Well, did you continue doing skip bombing after February?
No, that was my last skip bombing mission. Thank goodness we got out of that. The Germans were chased finally into Sicily. They were driven out. Those that weren't captured in Tunisia were driven over to Sicily. And of course our invasion of Sicily came July 10th of that summer of 43.
Right.
And I got a week off. I got a week off in Casablanca.
I see. Now, was Paul Leonard, had he already been killed by this time?
Paul Leonard?
Yeah.
You know, I have to...
That was General Doolittle's...
Oh, no, Paul Leonard, I was there when the night he was killed. That was at Biskra. That was in January when we were training to do these skip bombing missions, and the Germans were coming over. Biskra was in the southern part of
Algeria,
Tunisia. And maybe it was actually Algeria, but they were coming over every night and bombing us, and we had these holes in the ground. We jump in when the air raid signal came over. Doolittle came in that day and landed, and Leonard was his sergeant, you know.
Right.
And he jumped in a hole that night, and a bomb went into that hole and killed him. And I was in a hole about 100 yards away, about 100 yards away. We didn't find out till the next morning. There was nothing much left of him. That was his demise.
So what did you do in Casablanca when they give you a week off then?
Oh, I had a lovely our squadron doctor, Dr. Bungie, and I had become good friends. So he took advantage of my orders to go to Casablanca for a week off. He came with me, and we had a very memorable time for 1 week in Casablanca. Old Doc Bungie.
So,
great guy.
Tom, between after the skip bombing episode, what were you doing as far as missions between then and July of?
Well, our group went on several missions, and then our group was so shot up. What really caught 12th Air Force attention, they ordered an all-out effort by my bombing group for a bombing mission, and this was probably in February, late February, and we got 5 planes in the air. Out of a 48 plane, original 48 plane group, we got 5 planes in the air. We had all kinds of planes along the runways that our boys were stealing parts off to keep these 5 going. And that was it. Doolittle ordered our group back to Rabat, which is up north of, on the ocean, up north of Casablanca. And we spend February, March, April, in Casablanca, getting all new crews to build our group up to full strength again.
Now, was that the 319th Squadron?
Yes, that's the 319.
Yeah.
And we were there for at least 2 months. I can't remember the dates too well, but we got all these guys, new guys coming in. They had to be shown how to fly formation and all this stuff by the few veterans we had there. But we built up all the way up to strength again. And in about May, probably, sometime in May, I think it probably was, we went back up to the front to Tunisia. And I think soon after that, the Germans were all defeated there, and those that got away ended up in Sicily. Sicily was now the hot spot. Mm-hmm. And so we started bombing Sicily, and some Sardinia, but mostly Sicily. And on July 4th of 43, I was shot down over Sicily and captured.
What town was that you were shot down over?
We were going to
Cartagena, was it?
what? It was this town way in the eastern part of Sicily.
It wasn't Cartagena, was it?
No.
Cartagena?
Wait till I look at my map here. Turn off the thing and I'll look at my map and I'll tell you the name of it. We get some damn good stuff.
Catania.
Yeah, we were bombing Catania in eastern Sicily, and we were the lead ship of, I don't know, about 40 B-26s, and the group commander was in my ship, Colonel Herring, and we got hit big time. There was we had P-38s that we took with us from Tunisia, and we picked up a bunch of British Spitfires out of Malta. So we had a lot of pursuits with us, and the Germans were there with ME-109s and Focke-Wulfs, and they had a hell of an air battle all around us. And we were the lead ship of this formation, and we got hit, boy, and big fire right away. I'd gone back through the Bombay and was leaning out, taking pictures with the big box camera I had, like this, to see where our bomb patterns were down there. There's this big explosion. We all got out of the plane. Our top turret gunner and our waist gunner were captured by the Italians. The rest of us, the colonel and Griff Williams was flying co-pilot with the colonel. Griff Williams was another Doolittle raider. He and I were great buddies. And of course we all ended up in prison camp together. And we bailed out, and when I landed in a wheat field. Shoot, they had me captured. I was surrounded. By the time I got the air out of my chute, I was surrounded. And coming down, every once in a while I'd hear a bullet whistle by. Those German soldiers were taking pot shots at me. Fortunately, they didn't hit me. So that afternoon, they took me in a German general's office in Catania. And you're not supposed to shoot guys coming down in parachutes, so I said to this German general, do you give permission to your shoot boys to shoot at us when we're coming down in parachutes? He listened, he understood English, and he listened to me. And I said, this guy had his guns jammed. He couldn't get his gun. He made about 6 passes at me, and I kept waiting for the flashes on his guns, and they didn't come. And the German general heard me out, and he said, Hauptmann, he was not trying to shoot you, he was taking your picture. So this guy had an assignment for propaganda purposes, to get the picture of an American coming down. He picked on me. He made about 6 or 8 passes at me. And when I landed in that field, he came over waggling his wings at about 50 feet. So that's the story of it.
Well, I appreciate it very much. Thank you again.
A lot of strange things happen, and I got in the middle of a number of strange things.
I can imagine. Thank you again.